My topic is criminal groups and violence. And when I was thinking about this area, what I was thinking about is that organized crime per se comes in many different forms. And what I first want to do is tell you what I'm not going to talk about before I get to what it is I'm going to zero in on. Among the groups and organizations that engage in violent crime, there are a large number who have political agendas, social agendas, ideological agendas. These include terrorist organizations, for example, who commit criminal acts, criminal violence. Militias, revolutionary groups, hate groups. We have a group in the United States, large in the prison system, called the Aryan Brotherhood, which is a white hate group organization. Neo-Nazi groups. These are all organized groups that engage in some form of criminal violence. I'm not going to talk about any of those groups. What I'm going to focus on instead is what is more typically and traditionally thought of as organized crime. You know, the Godfather and the Mafia, that kind of organized crime, not some ideological agenda or political agenda or whatever. And also on street gangs as examples of groups that engage in criminal violence. First of all, true organized crime. Why do I call it true organized crime? Well, again, because there's a lot of reference to things, activities, organizations as being organized crime, when in fact, if you narrow the definition and clearly focus your thoughts, you will not see them as being organized crime. Organized crime groups exist for the sole purpose of making money out of crime. They don't care who the president is. They don't care who is in political control, only to the extent to which that might influence their business operation. They don't have any particular ideology. It's about making money from engaging in crime. It's a business. And that's important because the violence in which they engage is related to that fact, that what they're about is crime as business. Therefore, the violence is what I call instrumental. It's a utilitarian form of violence. It's used to accomplish a business purpose. For instance, to give you two traditional examples of crimes engaged in by what I call true organized crime. Extortion. Anybody not know what extortion is? Well, you don't want to say you don't know what extortion is. I'll tell you briefly what it is. Members of organized crime approach some kind of business, and they say to the business, in effect, you can imagine it's a small, could be like a little pizza operation on a corner. They go in and they say, basically, you have a nice business here. You're making good money and so on. Be ashamed if something happened to your business, had a fire or got robbed or whatever. We're willing to ensure that doesn't happen to you in return for 10% of your profits, 20% of your profits or whatever. And you have two choices. You can pay them the 10% or 20%, or guess what? Fire's going to occur. People are going to get beaten up going into your business, etc. In other words, the violence, and importantly, the delivery of the violence ensures that the organized crime group involved in this particular instance can successfully carry out that extortion. Another example is loan sharking. You know, people often, loan sharking is most typically related to gambling. So people gamble, they lose their money, they probably don't have good credit ratings to begin with. They're not going to be able to go to a bank or some legitimate loan place to get a loan, or grandma doesn't have any more money, or whatever the case is that she's willing to loan to them. So what do? They go to a loan shark. Loan sharks will loan them money at exorbitant interest rates in order to fulfill the amount that they lost. Where does the violence come in? You don't pay the money back to the loan shark. Now, loan sharks, in order to be successful, therefore have to do what? They're going to make sure that you pay the money back. They make sure you pay the money back through violence, or at least the threat of violence. So in both of those instances, the extortion and the loan sharking, it's the violence and ultimately the threat of violence, not the actual delivery, the threat of violence which ensures that they're successful in terms of carrying out their extortions and carrying out their loan sharking operations. Ultimately, the most successful of the organized crime groups, they use violence in a very limited sort of way, if at all. What happens is they get a reputation for violence. So when La Cosa Nostra walks in, somebody from the John Gotti, for example, from the Gambino crime family walks into the, now I'm making this up, walks into the pizza place and says, I want 20% of your profit. You don't say, no, get out of here. And he doesn't have to beat you up. You just give him 20% of the profit. Why? Because he is who he is. And because these people are who they are, and they've developed this reputation for violence. So that reputation becomes a very important dimension of their activity. And in fact, what you'll find, again, among the highest level, the most sophisticated of the organized crime groups, is actually violence avoidance. Now, why do you think that might be? Because violence attracts attention. This is a business. We don't want to attract police attention. We don't want newspapers writing about what we're doing. We're running a business. And therefore, the extent to which we can gain anything we want to gain just by the threat of who we are, then we're successful, and we don't actually have to engage in violence. A number of years ago, I was working with the New York State Organized Crime Task Force in Brighton Beach in Brooklyn, which is a Russian-Ukrainian neighborhood, where there was sort of fledgling forms of organized crime developing. And as typically happens, you have little turf wars that occur among the various criminal groups. Guess who the Russians brought in to mediate in the turf wars they were having? Italians. Why? Because the Italians had the reputation. They were brought in, they sat down, they had to sit down, they said, you do so-and-so, you do so-and-so, and everybody said, okay, we know if we don't do so-and-so and so-and-so, what's going to happen? Reputation guaranteed, all parties agreed, it was a contract, they enforced the contract, did not have to actually engage in any kind of violence. So, reputation, important. Now, irrespective of its actual use, instrumental violence, as I'm saying, is inherent to the core enterprises of organized crime. And as a consequence, it cannot be separated from the other elements of that core enterprise. So therefore, if we jump ahead to, okay, how can we combat this violence? You can only combat the violence by combating the enterprises, because the violence is related to that. You don't deal with for example, violence related to loan sharking by focusing on the violence. You got to deal with the gambling problem and with the loan problem and all those sorts of stuff if you're going to deal with loan sharking. All right. So, and this is why it becomes very difficult and very complicated to separate out a focus that might look only at the violence piece of what organized crime is doing. Okay, second prototype in this sort of spectrum of criminal organizations. And again, I want to say, don't see this as either or as a sort of black and white thing. It's a spectrum. Along this spectrum, you would have a number of criminal groups. Some are more sophisticated than others. They engage in different sorts of activities. Some have more capability, more reputation than others. So it's not like it's an either or kind of scenario. That said, another form of violent criminal group are these street gangs. Remember I said organized crime engage in instrumental violence. Street gangs engage in gratuitous violence. What is gratuitous violence? It's violence as an end in itself. It is violence for the sake of violence. So the gang members, these are typically younger people. They don't necessarily have to be juvenile. Some of them are in their early 20s, maybe even up to 30, that are participating in these street gangs. But it's all about macho. It's all about a willingness, violent attitudes, norms, a subculture that supports the use of violence, and their identity is associated with this willingness to use violence on the street and so on. So their end, unlike the more formal traditional organized crime, is not, they don't see it necessarily as a business out of which they're making money and they got all these things. Not that they don't engage in criminal activities from which they get money, but this reputation issue, this bravado, this macho notion, and being a member of the gang is more important to them. So you get, as I said, this kind of gratuitous violence. Okay, interventions. So we got these two different forms and two different kinds of violent activity going on. What can we do about this? True organized crime groups, the first of these kind, tend to have a much larger reach. They're more criminally sophisticated, and they have continuity over time and over crimes. Many of them operate transnationally as well. Gangs, on the other hand, tend to be more local and neighborhood focused. They live, they hang out, the criminal activities in which they engage and so on tend to be more localized. And as a consequence, they can be much more effectively targeted. If you got this local group in a particular neighborhood, lives there, hangs out there, commits their criminal activities there, you got a sort of geographical focus that you can zero in on. In contrast, the violence of true organized crime has to be multi-targeted. It has to go after the criminal enterprises, of which violence is just an instrument to carry out those enterprises. How to do that? I'll give you one example. And by the way, there's no country in the world, including the United States, that has really effective answers to how to go about doing that. We have, for example, in the US, what's called the RICO statute, Racketeer Influenced Corrupt Organizations Act, which is considered by people who prosecute organized crime but probably the most powerful legal instrument that they have to go after organized crime. I mean, it labels people as racketeers, it gives them sentences of 20 years or more. And by the way, the use of the RICO statute within organized crime led to a lot of people copping out because they were threatened with these long sentences. Prosecutors and police investigators in organized crime have a strategy that's called catch little fish and squeeze them to catch big fish. So you catch the lower level people in an organization, you threaten them with a RICO prosecution, which can put them in prison for 20 years, take all of the assets, the fruits of their criminal activity, you can seize those, you can bring civil action against them under the RICO statute, and maybe they decide it ain't worth it. I'm going to give somebody else up, and you just walk up the chain to do that. That's what Rudolph Giuliani did when he was a United States prosecutor in New York. Used that strategy against at the Fulton Fish Market and other places in New York City where they went after organized crime. In Holland, they used something that's called the Dutch administrative approach. And what it is a regulatory approach. They look at the fact that many of the businesses that are being penetrated by organized crime are subject to regulation and to licensing. So they use that regulation and licensing strategy, first of all, to make these businesses aware that they can be penetrated and maybe already are being penetrated by organized crime. And then they try to build in controls within the regulation to keep organized crime out. I'll give you an example. We have in New Jersey and Atlantic City, although they're falling like flies, gambling casinos. When the gambling casinos were set up, there was a lot of concern about they were going to become targets for infiltration by organized crime. So a whole regulatory mechanism was set up in order to screen out who are going to be the investors and the owners in these casinos. And that was done through this regulatory mechanism, through a licensing operation. So anybody who had any criminal record or activity or association with those sorts of activities could not at least be in the front line. Now that's not to say they're not 2, 3, 4, 5 levels back somewhere with some kind of investment, but at least in the front end, they couldn't be buying in to these casinos. So they used that construction business. New York City has had a huge problem with school construction with organized crime infiltration. Well, you bring about regulation. Who can get a license to do certain kinds of things? I mentioned the Fulton Fish Market, the same thing. Organized crime controlled all the trucking businesses that were bringing the fish into the Fulton fish market, controlled the entire fish, whatever it's called, the fish availability of fish in New York City, controlled by the mob. Right? They control the trucks, the truck drivers, the Teamsters Union, the delivery of the fish, the whole thing. When they set up a different licensing process, they screened out a number of these people and they brought in competition for bidding for these contracts as opposed to having monopoly, which was being controlled by organized crime. So the Dutch are using this, and they're using this to keep all other agencies of government and not simply rely on criminal justice and the criminal law to deal with this. But look at the fact that a great deal of organized crime makes more money out of engaging in white-collar kinds of activities than it does out of traditional organized crime activities. And there's a lot less threat to them of exposure. Things like extortion and street stuff and so on, that exposes you to law enforcement. But if you can penetrate some legitimate business 2 or 3 layers down and run that business and you rake off 20% or 30% of the profits, you're making good money without putting yourself at a lot of risk in terms of being exposed and arrested for this. So this is what the Dutch do with this sort of regulatory mechanism. How about the gangs, the street gangs? Well, there's a strategy that has been developed in the US called pulling levers. And Stephen is here from Harvard. Boston was the first site of this, this activity, of this method, called Operation Ceasefire in Boston. And basically what they do is, it's a deterrent strategy. They identify who the heavy hitters are in the street gangs. Heavy hitters meaning who are the most violent members of these street gangs. They identify them, and then they notify them, we know who you are, we know what you're doing, we're going to watch you, and if you just so much as spit on the sidewalk or throw gum somewhere, we're going to get you. Okay, so those guys are identified off the top. Then what they do is, and in fact, they do that. They track them. It's not just a threat. They follow up them because you got to have credibility in order to have deterrence. So they follow up on this. They pick these guys up. They lock them up sometimes, depending on what their behavior is. If they're on parole or probation, they violate them, right? They go back to jail. So they get the message that it's not just an idle threat. They're going to follow through on this threat and actually deliver on this. What else do? They bring in a variety of resources then as an alternative. You can't simply have, if you're talking about a carrot and stick method, you can't only have the stick. The stick is the cops on the street notifying these guys, arresting them, and locking them up. That's the stick part. If you don't create an alternative for people going into gangs in the first place and getting some of the same reward or satisfaction out of doing that, you're simply going to have this single strategy, and by itself it can't work. So what's the carrot? That's where the levers come in, the pulling levers. It means bringing together community organizations, religious groups, social welfare agencies, education, all the things that people talked about this morning that you need in communities and so on to have to deal with violence. Those are brought to bear. So the young men who are looking to join these street gangs around these macho reasons are provided an alternative. You can gain esteem by going to school or by getting a job. You don't have to be out there beating up people to be somebody. You can be somebody by following another route, and they show them that route and they support them within the community. Now, does it work with everybody? No, nothing works with everybody. But what they've shown in Boston and also in High Point, North Carolina, where they put in the same program, and in other cities in the United States, substantial reductions in violence as a consequence of this pulling levers strategy. So it's something that works. It's something that works if replicated with its various pieces, and it works in terms of having that particular focus on that kind of gang. Could you do this with the organized crime guys? No. First of all, they're not localized. Any level, I mean, what are you going to do? Say you can go to school? We're going to train you to get a job? I mean, it's a joke. You got to, with them, I don't mean joke in the total sense. I mean a joke if you dropped it as a strategy to deal with them. With them, you got to go after the enterprises. And if you go after the enterprises, you got to go after the customers of these enterprises. I used to tell my students, I taught class on organized crime, I said, you want to know the cause of organized crime? Look in the mirror. People who buy drugs, people who gamble, people who want to adopt babies illegally, anything you can think of that's made illegal or covered by some regulation, but that people want to do, and they'll pay for, that somebody's going to do that for you. And they make money out of it, and it makes a criminal business. All right? We have the classic example in the United States is prohibition. You know, we had this whole thing about we're going to get rid of demon alcohol, you know, because it's undermining our society. In fact, we had a constitutional amendment that outlawed alcohol. Did that mean that everybody suddenly, I don't want to drink anymore, I don't like beer, I don't like wine, I don't like any of those things, I'm not drinking anymore? No, didn't mean that at all. Some people actually did. Some people didn't drink anymore, but a vast majority of people found other ways. How did they find those other ways? It's called organized crime. They said, we got a whole new market. We can bring booze in from Canada. We can ship. I come from Long Island originally. Ships used to come off of Long Island, dump the stuff overboard. People go out in little boats, pick up barrels of whiskey and so on. But they also had good stuff. We had a president of the United States whose father had a great business in that. He also had something to do with Boston, I think. Anyway. That focus, it can't simply be on the criminal side, on what the group is doing. It's also got to be on the consumer side. And I suspect a lot of people who do this kind of stuff don't know. They don't realize that what's back there at some level is actually supporting organized crime. So when you want this thing that's illegal and you're willing to pay just to get it, despite the fact it's illegal, think about that. And think about where all of that is going. Okay, I got 5 minutes left. Manuel sent me 3 questions when I sent in my little paper to him. And I just want to quickly tell you what those questions were and tell you what my response is to those. About Operation Ceasefire, he wanted to know if I thought it could be successfully implemented in Mexico or Central America. Answer is probably not. I spent a lot of time in Mexico teaching a curriculum called Culture of Lawfulness to civics teachers, who in turn were to teach kids, and also we taught police officers in Mexico this particular curriculum. The principal beginning point of this Operation Ceasefire is the police. Well, I can tell you from personal experience, the public regard for the police in Mexico is extremely low. They have zero trust almost in the police in Mexico. So therefore, the beginning point would be very difficult to bring about because of that factor. Also, pulling levers requires you have the levers to be pulled. If in a community you don't have the strength of institutions and social organizations and religious organizations and so on that could come together and provide that foundation, you don't have those levers. So what are you left doing? Relying on the stick. And as I said before, reliance on the stick is not going to work. You got to have the carrot that goes along with that. Second question he asked had to do with organized crime in Russia, because I did a lot of work on Russian organized crime. He wanted to know whether I thought the decline in homicide rates in Russia since 1994 was a result of more effectiveness on the part of the Russian justice system to deal with organized crime there. My answer to that is no. I don't think it's a result. There's been a decline in homicides in Russia since 1994. First of all, if you look at the figures on homicide, I wouldn't trust them as far as I could throw them. They show some numbers declining, but if you look at the number of missing bodies and crimes that are not reported and so on, it's huge numbers, which suggest that somebody's getting more and more selective about what they report as being homicides in order to show that these numbers are declining over a period of time. I don't know that for a fact, but I'm suspicious that that might be the case. What is happening in Russia is there are fewer turf wars because the turf has gotten sorted out since 1991. People have got, the different groups have different areas and so on, and they recognize those areas, they sort that out, so they don't have to keep engaging in these turf wars. Also, there's been a shift from the more violent street kind of brutality organized crime to white-collar crime. Just as happens in other countries, as happened in the United States. They move into businesses. they move into, and in Russia, what used to be the public sector, into utilities companies and things of that kind, where it's safer to operate and the money's much greater. And you have much less need to rely on violence. The third thing, which does have to do with the role of government, that this message has gone out that the 1990s style of Wild West kind of stuff is no longer going to be tolerated. You know, drive-by shootings, car bombs, all that kind of stuff wouldn't be tolerated anymore. And the concern was the government get a lot of collateral casualties as a consequence of this. It's bad for business, for the country. Tourists don't want to come to Moscow when people are driving by, blowing up the hotels and shooting people on the street and so on. So that they dealt with because they had this other factor that was related to that. So indeed, those kind of crimes have gone down. Finally, the third question he asked had to do with he had been to Brazil. He visited this prison in Brazil that's apparently, I have not been to this prison, but apparently controlled by organized crime. So he wanted to know whether that was an unusual thing, and is it the case that organized crime can sort of run its own justice system? The answer to that is yes. Organized crime can, in fact, run its own justice system, and particularly in prisons, where if you can get certain criminal gangs that control within the prison, they run the prison. They run the operation. They establish what the rules are, and they enforce those rules. And of course, the way they enforce them is violence. Violence again is the tool that they're using to enforce what they're doing. Prisons. Any time I started in this business working in the correctional system, anytime prisons are run by prisoners, it's a bad thing. Prisons have to be run by the established people, the prison authorities, not by the prisoners themselves. So how could one deal with this? Well, first of all, it involves massive reform. For the police, you got to change recruitment. You got to find out who becomes cops, why do they become cops, some kind of merit system for selection, training programs, supervision programs, auditing of what they're doing, constant attention because the temptations for corruption are enormous everywhere. So you got to have constant auditing and supervision of the police operation in order to limit that. You got to somehow rectify the citizen distrust. And the police profession has to become professionalized and a respected profession. Otherwise, it will not work on either side. The police won't be able to do the real job they're supposed to do, and the citizens won't respect them and won't cooperate with them in terms of any other sort of activity. As far as the prisons, same thing. You got to look at who comes in as correction officers, how much you're paying them. You can't pay people minuscule amounts of money and put them into very powerful positions, because that's a recipe to exercise that power to augment the low wages they're getting. You can't do it with cops, and you can't do it with correction officers. You can't do it with teachers. And you can't do it with teachers. That's right. I mean, we know that from selling grades and all sorts of stuff. So again, recruitment, training, supervision, provision of resources, building a profession that people are respected when they have that profession. Otherwise, it's just a way to make money on the side and be cynical, and whatever goes, and everybody does it, so therefore there's not really that wrong, and I'm not a criminal, and all those kind of rationalizations. But none of those things are easy to do. I'll leave you with, if you want to see an example of an effort to do this, look at Palermo in Sicily. A mayor by the name of Leoluca Orlando brought in to try to restore the cultural artifacts and the association and the belief and respect for the culture in Palermo, where they had hundreds of years history of major organized crime. And they now have something called Addio Piso, goodbye Piso. Piso is protection money. So they had this whole scheme to get away from this extortion kind of thing that I was talking about. Civil society is the key, and citizen involvement is critical. The system, criminal justice system, cannot do this by itself. It's got to have that citizen involvement and citizen connection. And I would start with trying to build that kind of civil society and the confidence and respect of the people, probably the first thing to do. Thank you very much.